I had been on Althonis for about a month, working as part of Earth's first interstellar farming initiative. The planet was vast, rich in fertile soil, and had a climate suitable for growing crops that could feed millions. I was an unlikely candidate for the job, just a simple farmer from a backwater colony on Earth, trying to make a name for myself in the sprawling intergalactic economy. But somehow, my knowledge of terrestrial agriculture had landed me the position as head of operations for Earth's first farming venture in deep space. The local inhabitants of Althonis 4, the Althonians, were a mix of humanoid and semi-humanoid species. There was the tall, graceful Nastrians, like the one I would come to know quite well, and a host of other intelligent species that had long abandoned their warlike ways in favor of peaceful coexistence. To them, the art of massage was more than a way to relax. It was a spiritual practice, a way of connecting with the universe and the beings around them. I had heard about the massages during the first few days of my stay, but I didn't give them much thought. My schedule was packed with meetings, crop assessments, and logistics. Still, the more I worked with the Althonians, the more I learned about their culture. It was an odd thing to be immersed in, a mix of high-tech infrastructure and ancient traditions. The Nastrians, in particular, were the ones most dedicated to the practice of massage, and I had heard that they were considered to be the most skilled. It wasn't until I met Kanya that I would understand just how true that was. She was assigned to me by the station's administration as part of an offer I couldn't refuse, an interspecies partnership that included services to enhance my physical well-being. Kanya was beautiful, a striking alien with deep purple skin, jet black hair that shimmered in the sunlight, and eyes that seemed to hold the mysteries of the universe. Her presence was calming, but also overwhelming. There was an energy about her, something far beyond physical appearance, that made it impossible to ignore her. "Would you like a session?" Kanya had asked one evening after I had been working in my office for hours. Her voice was smooth, almost hypnotic, like velvet brushing against my ears. I had looked up from my console, unsure what to make of the offer. I had never been one for massages, never really saw the point, but the idea of an alien species providing a service seemed too intriguing to turn down. Maybe it was the allure of experiencing something so completely foreign, or maybe it was the undeniable pull of her presence. Either way, I couldn't resist. "Sure," I said, rubbing my neck. It was sore from hours of sitting in front of a console. "I think I could use it." She nodded and led me down a quiet hallway, away from the main administrative area. The building was sleek, modern, with large windows that looked out over the sprawling fields of crops I had helped plant. But there was an undeniable serenity in the air now, a strange shift as we entered her private space. The room was dimly lit, filled with soft, scented oils and plush cushions. The walls were adorned with murals depicting Nastrian traditions, some depicting their people in various states of relaxation, others showing images of their ancestors. Kanya asked me to lie down on a cushioned table in the center of the room. As I did, I noticed a subtle hum of energy in the air. It was something I had felt when she entered the room but hadn't thought much of, an almost electric charge that seemed to emanate from her body. I chalked it up to her unique physiology and moved on, assuming this was all just part of the ritual. "Just relax," she instructed softly, her voice lowering to a gentle murmur. Her hands were warm when they first made contact with my back. The sensation was strange at first, soft, almost feather-light, and yet, as she began to work her fingers into the muscles of my shoulders, I felt a strange release of tension. It was unlike any massage I had received on Earth. It wasn't just physical relief. It was as if her touch was reaching into my very core, unlocking something deep inside me. The pressure built gradually, her hands moving in smooth, rhythmic patterns, pushing deeper into my muscles. The feeling was intoxicating. For a moment, I forgot where I was, who I was. All that mattered was the sensation of her touch, the warmth of her hands, the way she seemed to know exactly where I needed relief. It was as if she could read my body, every knot and tension point, without me saying a word. "Is this all right?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with a strange intensity. "Yeah," I muttered, my eyes closing. "It feels amazing." There was a long pause. The atmosphere shifted subtly, like a cloud passing overhead. I could feel the temperature in the room rising, the air growing thicker, more charged. I opened my eyes to see Kanya standing above me, her face flushed. Her breathing had become more rapid, and there was a flicker of something in her gaze, something I couldn't quite place. I must apologize," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The hot period it's difficult to control sometimes. The need to connect, to release energy. It's powerful. I wasn't entirely sure what she meant by hot period, but it didn't matter at the moment. I was too caught up in the sensations her touch was creating. It felt as though her energy was weaving around me, entangling with my own, drawing out a deep heat that I had never felt before. It wasn't just physical warmth, either. It was an emotional heat, a need that seemed to come from deep within her. And that was when I heard the words I had hoped would never be uttered in that context. "My alien masseuse can't control herself during hot period." Before I could ask her what she meant, the entire room trembled. There was a sharp noise, the sound of metal groaning under pressure. The walls shook violently, and I could hear the sound of distant explosions from somewhere outside. "What was that?" I asked, sitting up quickly, my heart racing. I could feel her hands trembling on my back, the heat between us growing more intense. "It's nothing," she said, her voice unconvincing. "I'll deal with it. You stay here." I had no intention of staying behind while a battle raged outside. I stood up, pulling on my shirt, ready to face whatever was out there. But Kanya turned to face me, her eyes wide with a mix of desperation and something else, something primal. "No, you don't understand. The hot period, it affects more than just me. It affects everything." And with that, the door to the outside crashed open, and the battle for Althonis 4 began. The sounds of distant explosions rattled the building as Kanya's hands hovered over me, trembling with barely contained intensity. The sensation of heat was unlike anything I had ever experienced before, both physical and emotional, suffocating in its force. The room felt smaller, the air thick with the rising tension between us. Despite the growing danger outside, there was something undeniable in her touch, a kind of power that was both exhilarating and terrifying. I stood up abruptly, trying to shake off the strange combination of desire and unease that seemed to have taken root inside me. The way Kanya looked at me, her breath shallow, told me everything I needed to know. Something was wrong, something far beyond a simple massage. Her eyes locked onto mine, and in that instant I saw it. The battle raging inside her. The hot period was more than just a physical cycle for her people. It was a state of heightened emotion and energy, a volatile phase where their emotional control was tested to the limit. It wasn't just about sexual release or physical touch. It was about a deep, innate need to connect, to discharge an overwhelming surge of emotional energy that could be as destructive as it was powerful. I stepped back, my hands instinctively going to my blaster holstered at my side. "What's happening, Kanya? What's going on with you?" She closed her eyes, her hands still trembling as she tried to regain control. "It's my cycle," she murmured, her voice strained. I don't have much time to explain. The longer I go without releasing it, the harder it becomes to hold it back. I don't want to hurt anyone, especially not you." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. The situation was more complicated than I had anticipated. A battle was unfolding outside, and here I was, caught in the middle of a far more personal conflict, a battle between Kanya and the uncontrollable force within her. My farmer's instincts kicked in. I knew this was no ordinary fight, and if I wasn't careful, it could turn dangerous for both of us. Before I could respond, a deafening roar echoed from outside the building. The sound of heavy artillery and the whine of energy shields filled the air, signaling that the Trax raiders had launched their first assault. The sound of combat grew louder, closer. They were here. I have to go, I said quickly, grabbing Kanya's arm and pulling her toward the door. We'll figure this out later, but right now, we need to survive. She nodded, but I could feel her hesitation. She was struggling to contain the overwhelming surge of energy building inside her, and with every step, I could feel the heat radiating from her body. It wasn't just the temperature of the room anymore. It was the raw energy that poured off her, a swirling vortex of power that threatened to tear everything apart. We reached the outer doors of the complex and stepped into the chaos. The Trax Raiders were a terrifying sight. Insectoid in shape, with chitinous armor that gleamed like black stone, and eyes that burned with malevolent intelligence. They were relentless in their assault, using high-tech weaponry to tear through the station's defenses. Kanya's body tensed beside me, her breath quickening as the pressure inside her built. "Stay close," she said through gritted teeth, her hands glowing faintly with energy. "I won't be able to hold on much longer." I nodded, my heart pounding. I could feel it too, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. But there was no time for hesitation. I drew my blaster, my finger instinctively finding the trigger as I fired at the nearest Trax soldier. The energy beam struck the Raider square in the chest, sending it sprawling backward in a puff of acrid smoke. "Nice shot," Kanya remarked, but her voice was distant, her mind clearly focused on the battle within herself. Her movements had become more erratic, more urgent. Her hands surged with energy, sending shockwaves rippling through the air, toppling nearby raiders and blasting through their shields. "Focus!" I shouted, ducking behind cover as another wave of fire shot in our direction. The Trax were relentless, closing in from all sides. But Kanya was no longer entirely in control. Her body moved with a frantic energy, her glowing hands striking out in uncontrollable bursts of power. The very air around her vibrated with the force of her energy, creating shockwaves that sent raiders flying. But there was something else, something darker. With every burst of power, the temperature around us seemed to rise, the air growing thicker, suffocating in its intensity. "Help me!" Kanya gasped, her voice cracking. She was struggling, trying to keep the violent force inside her from tearing everything apart, but it was no use. Her hot period had taken over, and her control was slipping. The ground beneath us trembled as another explosion erupted in the distance. The Trax were advancing faster now, pushing us back toward the station's core. We needed to get out of here, but Kanya's out-of-control powers were making it almost impossible to move without causing more destruction. I needed to do something, anything, to calm her down or we wouldn't survive. "Kanya, listen to me," I shouted over the noise of battle. "You have to focus. You can control this." But her eyes were wild, and her body shuddered with the intensity of the energy surging through her. "I can't," she whimpered, her voice trembling with pain. "I can't hold it back any longer. I'm going to hurt you." "No," I said firmly, grabbing her by the shoulders and locking eyes with her. "You're not going to hurt me. I'm right here, Kanya. You're not alone." For a moment, there was silence between us, a strange calm that seemed to stretch through the chaos. Kanya's breathing slowed, and the heat around us began to subside, just enough for her to regain a modicum of control. But I knew it wouldn't last long. We were running out of time. "I need to get us to safety," I said urgently, glancing around at the advancing raiders. "Can you do that? Can you control it long enough for us to escape?" Kanya nodded, her face pale but determined. "I'll try." With her powers still flickering, we moved through the battlefield, narrowly avoiding incoming fire as we made our way toward a nearby escape shuttle. The raiders were closing in, but Kanya's strength was beginning to return. She focused all her energy on creating barriers, using her powers to blast the Trax out of our path as we fought our way toward the shuttle. And as we finally reached the ship's ramp, I heard Kanya whisper, "I'll keep you safe. I promise." But as the shuttle doors closed behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was far from over, and that Kanya's struggle was just beginning. The shuttle's engines roared to life, sending a tremor through my body as it lifted off the ground. The battlefield outside quickly shrank, and we ascended into the turbulent skies above the station. I was still trying to process what had just happened. The overwhelming power Kanya had unleashed, the ferocity of the Trax Raiders, and the fact that we were barely escaping with our lives. Kanya sat beside me, her body still trembling from the exertion, her eyes wide and distant. She had barely said a word since we boarded the shuttle, her thoughts lost in the maelstrom of her emotions. I knew she was struggling to regain control, to suppress the heat building inside her, but I didn't know how much longer she could hold it in. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. I wasn't sure if she heard me, or if she even had the energy to respond. She turned her head toward me, her purple skin still flushed, but her eyes, those deep, penetrating eyes, focused on me for the first time since the chaos began. "I'm fine," she said, though the strain in her voice betrayed the words. "But we're not safe yet. The Trax will follow us." I nodded, trying to make sense of the situation. The Trax Raiders had been relentless, using advanced tactics to infiltrate the station and overpower the defenses. But now that we were airborne, we had a brief window of time before they could mount a proper counterattack. As if on cue, an alarm blared from the shuttle's cockpit, its red lights flashing urgently. A warning signal. Trax ships had locked onto us. "Here they come," Kanya whispered. Her voice was low, but the tension in it was unmistakable. "They're not giving up. We need to escape their tracking systems." I quickly moved to the cockpit, hands shaking slightly as I strapped myself into the pilot's seat. The controls were far more complex than anything I'd ever worked with back on Earth, but I had enough training to get the shuttle off the ground and keep us airborne. I wasn't a pilot, but the principles of flight were the same no matter where you were. "Can you help with the shields?" I asked, glancing over my shoulder at Kanya, who had followed me into the cockpit. She nodded wordlessly, her hands glowing faintly with the same energy that had pulsed through her during the battle. "I'll do what I can," she said, her voice steady, though I could sense the strain. The Trax ships were closing in fast, their sleek, insectoid forms darting through the sky like hunting predators. I gripped the controls, pushing the shuttle into a steep dive, banking hard to the left as I tried to avoid the Trax-S lock-on. A series of sharp bursts from the enemy ships rocked the shuttle, slamming me back into my seat. The shields flared with each hit, but they were holding for now. Kanya extended her hands toward the console, her energy flaring brighter as she focused. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the air thickening again with the tension that coursed through her. The shuttle's shields glowed brighter as she channeled her power into them, creating a protective barrier that absorbed the Trax-S energy blasts. But I could tell it wouldn't last long. The Trax ships were relentless, their weapons designed to break through even the strongest shields. We needed to get out of their range, or we would be sitting ducks. "Hang on!" I shouted, pulling the shuttle into a steep climb, hoping to break through the clouds and escape their line of sight. But just as I thought we might have a moment to breathe, another explosion rocked the shuttle, this time directly beneath us. The shuttle spun violently, throwing me against my restraints. Kanya gasped, her glowing hands flaring brighter in panic as the shuttle descended rapidly. "Stabilizing thrusters. Now!" I barked, trying to steady the ship, but the damage was too severe. We were losing altitude fast, and I could see the sharp, jagged peaks of Althonis Ivy's mountains approaching at an alarming rate. "We're going down!" Kanya cried out, her voice laced with desperation. She was pushing her energy to its limit, trying to keep the shuttle from crashing, but it wasn't enough. We were too far gone. The shuttle slammed into the side of a mountain with a sickening crunch, the impact sending shockwaves through my body. The world went dark for a moment, the air thick with smoke and the scent of burning metal. When I regained consciousness, I was still strapped into the pilot's seat, blood dripping from a gash on my forehead. I gasped for air, disoriented. The shuttle was half buried in the side of the mountain, the emergency lights flickering dimly. Kanya was slumped beside me, her breathing shallow but steady, though she was covered in cuts and bruises. Her energy had subsided, but she was still reeling from the aftermath of the hot period. "We need to get out of here," I said, shaking my head to clear the fog. The tracks would be upon us soon. They were relentless, and if we didn't move fast, they would find us. Kanya stirred beside me, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at me, her face pale, but her expression was one of determination. "We don't have much time," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The raiders will come looking for us. We have to move." I nodded, undoing my restraints and carefully helping her to her feet. The shuttle's hull was damaged, and the emergency exit was blocked by debris. We would have to find another way out, but I knew that getting to the surface and finding shelter would be our only chance. As we made our way toward the rear of the shuttle, the sound of the cracked ships overhead grew louder. I could feel the heat rising once again from Kanya's body, her energy surging unpredictably. Her hot period wasn't over. In fact, it was only getting worse, and if she couldn't control it soon, I feared the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for us, but for everyone on this planet. We had no choice but to move quickly. The tracks would be searching for us soon, and I didn't know how much longer we could hide. But we had one advantage: the planet itself. "Let's head into the mountains," I said, grabbing her hand. "We'll hide until we can figure out how to get back to the station." Kanya nodded, her face set in grim determination. As we pushed through the wreckage, I could only hope that this was the right move. The heat between us was growing, her energy out of control, the tracks closing in, and the mountain looming before us as our last chance for survival. We had entered the next phase of the battle, and there was no turning back. The crash had scattered the shuttle's remnants across the rugged terrain of Althonis Ivy's mountains, a jagged stretch of stone and ice. The air was thin here, the biting cold a stark contrast to the raw, oppressive heat that radiated from Kanya's body. We had barely escaped with our lives, but there was no time to celebrate our survival. The tracks were relentless, and the danger wasn't over. I could hear the distant hum of their insectoid ships circling the mountains, searching for us, ready to pick us off if we made even the smallest mistake. We had to keep moving, keep hiding. Kanya was visibly exhausted, her body trembling with the strain of the hot period, her uncontrollable emotions swirling in an almost palpable force that I could feel, even at a distance. I helped her up, wrapping her arm around my shoulder for support as we carefully navigated the rocky terrain. Each step was more difficult than the last, the cold seeping into my bones as I tried to keep my pace steady. The wind howled between the craggy peaks, and the temperature seemed to drop with every passing minute. "Can you keep it together?" I asked quietly, keeping my eyes on the path ahead. "We're not safe yet." Kanya's response came in the form of a shudder, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She was doing everything she could to stay focused, but the energy inside her was growing stronger with each passing moment. I could feel it, a wave of raw emotion, like a distant storm on the horizon, gathering strength. "I'm trying," she said, her voice strained, "but I can feel it inside me. The need to release, it's overwhelming. And if I don't, I could hurt you, or worse." I glanced at her, seeing the genuine fear in her eyes. It wasn't just physical control she was struggling with. It was the emotional intensity, the uncontrollable heat of desire, frustration, and power that threatened to tear through her. And she was terrified of losing herself in it, of becoming a danger to me, to anyone in her path. "You're not going to hurt me," I said, trying to reassure her, though the doubt lingered at the back of my mind. "We'll find a way. We just need to get to cover. There's got to be something we can use in these mountains to hide, to throw them off our trail." She nodded weakly, though it was clear that the weight of the situation was taking its toll. Every time her powers surged, her body responded by burning with heat, like an internal furnace that was slowly running out of control. Her energy was a living thing, turbulent, wild, and it made the very air around us shimmer with a strange intensity. We reached a narrow ridge, the sharp edges of the rocks slicing into the air, casting long shadows over the valley below. I pulled her to the side, crouching down behind a rock formation that offered some shelter from the wind and the prying sensors of the tracks. "Rest," I told her, though I knew it wasn't much of a command, more of a desperate hope. "We need to stay low. If we can't outrun them, maybe we can outsmart them." Kanya sank down, her face pale but resolute. She was breathing heavily now, her chest rising and falling with the effort. The energy around her was so thick, so tangible, that it felt like the very rocks beneath our feet were vibrating with it. She closed her eyes, clearly focusing hard, trying to bring herself back to equilibrium. "I can't keep this up much longer," she murmured. "The longer it goes on, the harder it becomes to control. I'm afraid that if I don't release the energy soon, it will take over completely." I could see the desperation in her eyes, but I also saw the strength. This wasn't just about survival. It was about Kanya fighting against a part of herself she couldn't fully control. Her species, the Nastrians, had evolved to handle this hot period as a natural part of their cycle. But it was more than just a biological necessity. It was an emotional crucible, one that tested every fiber of their being. And Kanya was fighting it, struggling against her own nature, for fear of what she might become. "How do you release it?" I asked, my voice a little quieter now. I didn't know how I could help, but I needed to understand. She shook her head, her eyes distant. "It's not something I can just control easily. For some Nastrians, it's a ritual, a release through physical connection. But even then, it's dangerous. We have to be careful. We have to be certain. And I don't want to hurt you." I knew what she meant. She wasn't talking about sexual release. She was talking about her powers, the dangerous energy she could unleash if she lost control. I could see it in the way her hands twitched, her fingers sparking with barely contained power. The longer we stayed out in the open, exposed, the more she was at risk of losing control. "We'll figure it out," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We just need time." But time was running out. The tracks would have already begun their search, and they would be closing in on us soon. The mountains weren't going to keep us hidden forever. The tracks had tracking technology far superior to anything I had seen before, and we couldn't afford to waste time. Kanya's body stiffened beside me. Her breath quickened as her powers flared once again. A gust of wind swept across the ridge, carrying with it the unmistakable hum of the track's ships. They were getting closer, their searchlights sweeping the ground, scanning every inch of terrain in a wide arc. "We need to move," I said urgently, standing up. "We can't stay here." Kanya looked up at me, her eyes filled with both gratitude and fear. "I can't control it much longer." "Then we'll do this together," I said, taking her hand firmly. "We won't let them get us. Not now." But as I helped her to her feet, a sudden, violent surge of energy erupted from Kanya, pushing us both back. The ground beneath us cracked, a loud explosion of sound ripping through the air as Kanya's power unleashed itself in a wave of raw, uncontrolled energy. The rocks around us shattered, sending debris flying in all directions. For a moment, I was thrown to the ground, the force of the blast knocking the wind out of me. I looked up to find Kanya standing amidst the wreckage, her eyes wild, her body alight with a fire that I could feel even from a distance. Her energy was fully unleashed now, raw, unbridled, and the air around us crackled with the force of it. She was no longer in control. "Get down!" I shouted, scrambling to shield myself from the shockwave. The track ships had already locked on to our location. The moment Kanya's energy burst outward, the raiders knew exactly where we were. But instead of retreating, I made a choice. I grabbed Kanya's hand once again, pulling her toward the cliff's edge. "We're going to fight," I said, my voice unwavering. Together. Kanya looked at me, her face strained, her power swirling around her like a storm. For the first time, I saw not just fear in her eyes, but something else, something fierce. And with that, I knew we had a fighting chance. The battle was far from over, and in that moment, I realized something. Survival wasn't just about outsmarting the enemy. It was about learning to fight the battles within. And Kanya was learning to control her own power, even if it meant embracing the chaos. We had no choice but to move forward, and the fight had only just begun.